Okay, I chose this picture of lap-lap being folded because serial verb constructions in Vatlongos involve folding a lot of stuff into them, and also because I feel that I have folded a lot into this talk. I looked at my abstract and thought, this is 3 talks. What were you thinking? So that's my excuse for focusing on the things I find most interesting, because there isn't time to cover everything, but I'm very open to having questions about some of the other basic things I haven't really been able to cover. Okay, so I'm going to start with an introduction about the context, what I mean by serial verb constructions, and what I'm looking at. Then I'm going to look at the form of Vatlongos serial verb constructions, the function, and what I've been able to find out about the sociolinguistic distribution of when these are used. Okay, so as we saw yesterday, these are the villages where Southeast Ambrym is spoken. What I didn't tell you is that it's also spoken by a large community on Efate, just outside Port Vila in Melemart there. And about a third of speakers are actually in Melemart. So when I'm looking at the sociolinguistic distribution, the main focus of my PhD project was differences in how the language is spoken there compared to on the island. This is some information about the corpus that I was using for this. It was recorded between 2000 and 2017 for that PhD project. It includes narratives, procedures, histories, conversations, some elicitation and other things. It involves speakers from all of the Vatlongos-speaking villages, and the description that I'm giving you is based on a larger transcribed and indexed corpus of 66,000 words, but the frequency information is based on a subcorpus of 48,000 words of spontaneous text, because obviously serial verb constructions would be very overrepresented if you include elicitation, because I just would not stop asking questions about them. Most of the texts in the subcorpus are available via Pangloss, and at this point I would like to thank all of the speakers, but especially my language assistants, including Madeline, who is an incredible transcriber, and that's Madeline there. She's brilliant. What do I mean by serial verb construction? This is the bit that I'm going to say much faster than I should. I'm going to give you a very brief 1-slide definition of serial verb constructions, which is completely unrealistic. But what I mean by serial verb constructions here is that there's more than one verb in a clause. The component lexemes are verbs, and so not auxiliaries, adverbs, prepositions, something else, and not kind of homophonous auxiliaries, adverbs, or prepositions. This has to be a construction, so it needs to be productive and conventionalized. The component verbs share arguments, so in Vatlongos it's mostly same subject switch function, which means where the object of the first verb is the subject of the second verb. I'm also including event argument, which are maybe a little bit more controversial, where the event described by the first verb is the subject of the second verb. And component verbs share tense, aspect, mood, and polarity values. That could mean single marking. It could mean concordant marking, so they're both marked the same somehow. And if they're both marked the same, if they're both marked and have the same value, that probably means that they're matching. But in Vatlongos it doesn't. You have a system of concordances, which is what I'm going to show you here. And there is it's not subordination, it's not coordination. So there needs to be no option to use overt subordinators, coordinators, or participles. So that's a kind of very brief summary of the criteria that I've used to describe these as serial verb constructions. And there's a lot more references on this, but those are some of the ones that I found most useful. Terry Crowley's work on Parmese serial verb constructions has been really influential in how they're described in Oceanic languages. Parmese is the language that is most closely related to Vatlongos, so the system is quite similar. So during this section on the form, I'm going to be pointing out the ways in which Vatlongos serial verb constructions are not the same as Parmese, where there are differences and similarities. So let's talk about the form. Starting with argument sharing and indexing, they have all of these possibilities, and the subject of each verb is a transparent representation of what the argument structure is, which is quite neat. So it's quite easy to establish that these are in fact same subject switch function, inclusory or event argument. So in the first one, both verbs share a subject and they're both marked for third person dual. In the second one, you have here as the third person plural, it's the object of the first verb, which we can be confident about because that first verb is a transitive verb which has to take either an object noun phrase or a suffix. And the subject of the second verb is marked third person plural. Inclusory serial verb constructions are possible. So this is where the object, the subject of the second verb includes the subject of the first verb. And this is really common where both the subject and the object of the first verb are the subject of the second verb. So here, I carry my baby, we come here, is a kind of literal translation of that. So we is dual, it's referring to me and my baby. Okay, and there are also event argument serial verb constructions where the second verb takes a default third person singular marking, and I'll show you an example of that later. Okay, all of these are also possible in Parmese, so no particular differences there. Also, like Parmese, we have a system of morphological tense or mood dependencies. I'm analysing the TAM distinctions in Vattelongos as mostly relative tense and some modal categories. Crowley analyses the equivalent in Parmese as modal categories realis and irrealis, but basically aside from that, they're similar. These things marked in blue are the same as Parmese. So basically, in affirmative polarity, you just have matching. That's quite straightforward. Prior isn't marked the same as Parmese because this category just doesn't exist in Parmese. In negative polarity, in the non-future, which is equivalent to realis in Parmese, we have a similar thing where the second verb is marked immediate future and affirmative polarity, even though the meaning of the whole thing is taken to be negative. Both verbs are actually negative in their interpretation, but the second one is marked affirmative. And in Parmese, that's true of all of the negative things. The second verb is always marked affirmative rather than negative. What we find in Vattelongos, which I think is one of the most interesting differences, is that the second verb in immediate future, distant future, or prior can be marked as negative with a prefix. And this brings me on to the next slide. Marking of negation in Vattelongos has two parts, a prefix and a clitic. But in these second parts of the second verbs are only marked with the prefix, not with the clitic. And that would be ungrammatical in an independent clause. So this is a really nice diagnostic of this being a serial verb construction, of it being a monoclausal construction. So you can see that for the first one, you only have one negative clitic, which isn't surprising because it's marked affirmative. The second one, we have a future meaning, and you have a negative clitic occurring after the first verb, but no negative clitic after the second verb. If that verb was in an independent clause, it would be ungrammatical because there's no clitic. So you only ever get one negative clitic for the entire clause. And that's what I find most interesting about the formal stuff that's happening here. The other thing that's quite interesting typologically is that these serial verb constructions are extremely non-contiguous. By that I mean that many elements can intervene between the component verbs. So you can have object-noun phrases intervening, which isn't particularly unusual. We saw that example already. You can also have prepositional phrases occurring between the two verbs. So this is actually, it's not particularly pointed out by Crowley, but it is found in one of his examples in his grammar. For what he calls locutive serialization, you can have a preposition phrase saying who you're speaking to occurring before the main verb of speech, bitene he say, and the second verb, which is kind of like a verbal complementizer. And it is subject to exactly the same morphological dependencies we've seen, which is why I do think this really is a serial verb construction, but you have a whole preposition phrase in between. I also have some examples with locational preposition phrases in there as well in those second two examples, which I haven't found evidence for in Parmese in reading Crowley's works. I'm not sure if it happens there or not, but this is more unusual. Also unusual is that you have adverbs occurring between the two component verbs. And this is a bit like Parmese. So Crowley describes some cognate clitics. He analyzes them as clitics that occur between the two verbs, so he has an equivalent of sung meaning then, but he, thank you, says that it's a clitic. In Vatlongos, these seem to be adverbs. There's no particular evidence for them being phonologically dependent. And you also get longer adverbs like vitali a bit, which is far too long to think of as a clitic. And you can even get both. So I have one example here where you have a preposition phrase and an adverb. So I will say to us just like this. And this is my example of an event argument. Imak is a verbal demonstrative like this, and it's modifying the first thing. This is somebody giving a speech, the kind of beginning of a speech. So, very non-contiguous compared to other things. Those are the most interesting things about the form of Vatlongos serial verb constructions. But please feel free to ask me things in more detail. I realize it's had to be really quick. And this next bit on the function of Vatlongos serial verb constructions is going to be extremely quick, because this is the bit I decided had to go. So, just to give a 2-slide summary of the different functions of serial verb constructions in Vatlongos. The main reason I want to include this is because they occur very frequently. I have a serial verb construction occurring once every 25 words in the spontaneous corpus. And that is partly because they serve such a huge range of functions. So they can express a huge range of different semantic relationships between the component verbs, from something quite loose to something quite tight. So these ones are maybe the most dubious, and I haven't included examples, but you can use a question verb to question the manner of something. And I want to say that that question has quite a different information status than the first verb. So that seems quite loose. And you can make kind of evaluative comments that might be the main point of what you're saying. You use them for adjunct-like modification in those event argument examples. You can use them for prior motion if you use come or go as the first verb. You use them for directional modification, which is really common, and we've seen lots of examples of that. And you can also use them for sub-events within complex events. So in those ones where it's like hit, kill, hit, die, you can think of hitting and dying as two separate parts of the same event. Okay. They also have a range of grammatical functions, from integrating direct quotations, which we saw with that locutive serialization, integrating complement clauses, increasing valency, introducing oblique arguments that are probably part of the verbs, part of what's required by the verb. They're used for inchoative aspect with come, and deontic modality with a bislama loan verb must. For must. Okay, that's it. That's the functions. That's all I'm telling you. But please feel free to ask about any of them. Now I'd like to get on to the main thing I want to talk about very quickly, the sociolinguistic distribution. So as a reminder, here are the Vatlongos speaker communities that I distinguished, and I'm going to give you some of the kind of a rough guide to what those communities are like. So Ase Taviak is what I've called the villages between Ase here and Taviak in the south. Here there's people generally have rural livelihoods. There's fairly robust transmission of Vatlongos to children. Vatlongos is used in church services, and as we heard yesterday, it's increasingly used in education. I've distinguished Endu as a community because it has its own distinct dialect, Endu Vatlongos dialect. This is the northernmost village. There are quite puristic attitudes to language there. There's a feeling that mixing with Bislama is wrong, mixing with the dialect spoken to the south is wrong. And there's intermarriage and cultural ties with Northern Ambrim, and competition with North Ambrim in family domains, especially where the mothers speak North Ambrim. There's exposure to tourists visiting the volcano. This is the one place where you do get a kind of international tourist presence in Ambrim, in southeast Ambrim. And Bislama is used in church services rather than the Vatlongos. Melemart is a peri-urban community. They relocated in the 1950s following a volcanic explosion. There's therefore more exposure to Bislama, English, and French. There seems to be interrupted or at least delayed transmission, where children are very reluctant to speak Vatlongos, but often start speaking Vatlongos as teenagers. And Vatlongos doesn't seem to be being learned by newcomers. There's no kind of pressure on newcomers to learn Vatlongos. Okay, getting down into the corpus, these are, the subcorpus contains 104 spontaneous texts and 48,000 words. It is grouped by some speaker variables and a text-based variable. So these are the age categories I've decided to use, from under 31, 31 to 45, 46 to 65, thank you, and older than 66. As you can see, the youngest age group is quite underrepresented there. That is the breakdown by community. I have many more texts from Asay Tabiak than Endu or Melemart, but this isn't too bad a representation of the split in the speaker community. Slightly more men by women, although that's less bad by text. This is because this is by word. Men talk for longer, is what I found. Yeah, seems to be possible. Okay, and for genre, I have decided to split up genre based on the kind of the ways in which speakers grouped these rather than any other thing. This is how people kind of referred to what they were talking about. So for narrative, that's a kind of any sort of narrative, especially custom narratives are big in there. And also sort of danger narratives. Animals refers to narratives about animals that are directed to children. So they kind of have protagonists who are speaking animals who go through various things, and they're sort of like fables. Job was an interesting genre that came up a lot, where people give me their employment history, basically. So it's a kind of autobiographical text, but it also involves a few procedural things where they're explaining what they're doing. So that felt like a potentially different genre. And then miscellaneous, which contains everything else. I actually, by text, collected a lot of procedural texts, but once they're much, much shorter than the narratives and other things, so it didn't make sense to group those separately. And then the years of education is fairly typical for Vanuatu overall. Just over half of the corpus is by people who are educated to a primary level and not beyond primary. And then up to year 10 is 7 to 10 years education is sort of you finished secondary school. More than 11 years is you have done, maybe you've had to go to another island to study at that point. You've gone quite far with your education there, including a few people, especially in Melemart, who have had some tertiary level education. Okay, so both the contents and the who was speaking were determined by kind of community and speaker priorities. This is in no way a balanced sample that would be best practice for corpus linguistics. But what I wanted to do was work out how much we could find out from a typical documentation corpus, rather than trying to kind of change what was being documented with the community in order to align with what I wanted to find out. So that's a kind of caveat to what I'm saying. The constructions, different grammatical constructions, verbal constructions that I was looking at were tagged per pause unit in the Flex database. So this is an example in Flex of a sentence with translations in English and Bislama. And this note field, B means there's an auxiliary, thank you, an auxiliary verb construction, and D means there's a serial verb construction in there. So the rat then went and chased the pigs over, is the meaning there. So Mingol Weli Beme, it's a switch function serial verb construction. This corpus was imported into R using the interlinear R package written by Sylvain Loiseau, which is very useful. It imports it as a group of linked data frames. Very useful package that everyone should know about. Serial verb constructions occur once every 25 words in the corpus. The way that I've expressed that is normalized frequency by 10,000 words. 10,000 words is about the size of the smallest community corpus for Endu. So that's why I decided that was the relevant base for normalization. And what I've tried to do here is model the normalized frequency per text. I'm going to make some justifications of how I've done that, but I don't know how relevant this is. The best model for this data is over-dispersed Poisson. It's Poisson because this is count data. It's about how often something occurs in time or space. In this case, how often a construction occurs per words in the corpus. This is different from if you were trying to work out how often a word occurs in the corpus, because you can't treat each word as a trial for whether the construction is there or not. You have to approach this differently from what's normally used for lexical frequency in corpora. It's over-dispersed because the occurrence of a serial verb construction in text makes it more likely that there will be another one. For lots of linguistic and cognitive reasons, we expect there to be proneness in this data, where if you have one, you're more likely to have others. And that might be because of repetition that is really frequent in speech and in oral narratives. For language-specific repetitive strategies, so in Vatlongos, there's quite a lot of tail-head linkage, for example. Thank you. And also potentially because of structural priming, and there are various studies which show that once you've used one thing, you might then be primed to use it again. So therefore, it's modeled with negative binomial regression, which is a normal way to approach over-dispersed Poisson data. For the model, I have included all of those factors that I showed you already: age, community, gender, education, and genre. And I have not tried to remove factors that were not significant, because I know that there are imbalances in the corpus. So for example, the corpus from Melemart had a much older demographic than the corpus on the island. On the island, young people were more keen to be involved. And on Melemart, there was more kind of veneration of elderly speakers. They wanted to document that. So if I included community and age and then removed one of them, it would look like the one that was left might be significant, but actually that might be an effect of the other one. So rather than trying to kind of remove the things that weren't significant, I want to keep them all there, because the aim isn't to create the most efficient model here. The aim is to identify interpretable patterns in the data that are meaningful. So that's why I haven't tried to kind of remove things that weren't significant, because I know that this isn't balanced. Okay, I have 1 minute to go through what I found out. Here, the significant effect was to do with education. Basically, the more education, the higher the level of education, the less likely you are to use serial verb constructions. So if you take primary education as the baseline, and you saw that more than half of people were educated just to primary level, speakers who were educated from 7 to 11 years were only 77% as likely to use serial verb constructions in this model, and speakers educated more than 11 years were only 70% as likely to use serial verb constructions. And that was a significant effect. Why might that be? It might be greater exposure to English. This is an overwhelmingly Anglophone community. There were very few Francophone speakers in the corpus. And there are no serial verb constructions in English. It could be influence from Bislama, because there's more exposure to Bislama. Bislama has less morphologically complex serial verb constructions than what you've seen here, and doesn't use them for exactly the same range of functions. For example, not using them for introducing speech. And I think what might be the case, which is a bit sad, is that it might be to do with sort of language attrition and less fluency in Vatlongos for these speakers who have been removed from Vatlongos speaking environments for large chunks of their education. And there's various evidence from studies cross-linguistically that semi-speakers often avoid complex structures. It may also be something to do with stylistic effects, and what I want to look at there is the near significant effects of genre. So in this model, serial verb constructions were 1.5 times more likely to occur in those child-directed animal narratives than in the miscellaneous texts. And this was significant by the coefficients, but it wasn't significant looking at the confidence interval, so I don't want to pump this up too much, but it's certainly something going on. And maybe serial verb constructions index a kind of childish or a dramatic style. In those stories, there's often a lot of focus on physical events, like this person chased that person, they hid in a hole. Maybe that's why you end up with more serial verb constructions here. And they were 10% less likely to occur in those job narratives, job texts, which might be because there's a sort of wider temporal perspective in there. You kind of say, I did this for 5 years, rather than saying, this happened and then this next thing happened, and you're really focusing on the space. And it might be that serial verb constructions seem to be used less in discussing town life, which links to, there was also it was nearly significant by both, but not quite. Speakers from Melemart were 14% less likely to use serial verb constructions than speakers in Assay Tabiag. So this could be a sign of emerging stylistic differences between the communities, but I think it's more likely a side effect of the skewed sample, because the Melemart group had high levels of education, which seemed more significant, and more job texts versus animal texts as well. To summarize, Vatlongos has formally complex serial verb constructions with a complex system of morphological tense aspect mood dependencies. You can only have one negative clitic even where you have multiple negative prefixes, which is cool. It's unusually syntactically loose, unusually non-contiguous, and there are some differences from closely related Parmese, which shows how serial verb constructions can vary even between very closely related languages. They occur very frequently and express a wide range of semantic relationships and grammatical functions. They are less used by more educated speakers, more used in child-directed narratives, and less used in employment histories. Thank you. Namaste.
Thanks, Eleanor. There is any question?
Thanks, Anna.
Hello, thank you for great talks, really interesting. I think it's great that you look at both the difference between speakers, but also the correlation with text types. There is a great paper by Bill Foley who looks at production of different text types and looks at a folk story on the one hand and a traditional narrative on the other hand. And I think he makes a very good point that we have to be careful with stimuli-based stuff, although I'm all for stimuli-based stuff. What he doesn't do, at least in that paper, is distinguish that it's not just traditional narrative versus a frog story, but it's also a educated bilingual speaker who's doing the frog story versus a monolingual speaker who's much older and had less formal education in the narrative text. And then something that may or may not be relevant for serial verb constructions in your question is a known text versus a novel text. So a known text, if we tell the same Cinderella story, and we actually know everybody in the community knows what's happened and also who the referents are, we can be quite negligent about introducing and tracking them. So we may not use the same pattern as a story where we all need to know, and there is this character happening or coming, whatever, and this is what happens. So this is actually something that's not as such genre, but correlates with genre. And it may trigger different constructions because we attribute to the audience a different level of knowledge and a different need to spoon feeding them information. So I think it all correlates, and it's very difficult to tease apart, but one has to at least think about the roles of these different things.
Yes,
and you do that, and it's great.
Yeah, I looked at that that article, and I found what was interesting is that I also looked at subordinate clauses. Certainly, I looked at complement clauses, and I didn't find the differences that he discussed. Where in the frog story one, he found a lot more use of those types of complex structures and multi-clausal structures. I didn't find that effect at all here in anything between the animal or anything else. I also did include 2 frog stories in there, and I then checked whether it was matching with the other animal stories or not. And what I found was that the frog stories were kind of like showed exactly the same trends as the other animal narratives, but even more so. So it was kind of like an animal narrative on steroids.
And a new one rather than the other ones.
Yeah,
may
exactly.
Have been
I think that may have been a big part of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Miriam.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting talk. I've got masses of things that I would love to talk to you, and I won't hog the question on because I saw a lot of other hands going up, but there were 2 questions that I did want to ask you. One is, did you tell us how many serial verb constructions you're talking about here? I wasn't sure if I missed that, what your corpus is. I was trying to do a, sort of back of the,
Yeah, I should have done that. Let me work that out.
Notepad is somewhere between 100 and 500, but how, once you start doing the quantitative stuff, it's going to be much stronger if you've got 500 than if you've got 100 in your corpus.
40.
But anyway.
No, it's a lot. It's more than, it's several thousand.
Oh, okay. So, okay. So that
because
was
it's once every 25 words in 44,000, so 11,000.
Yes, but no, because once every 25 words, I mean, they're multiple word constructions.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, we can talk about this later. But anyway, so somewhere in the thousands, but it won't be like multiple thousands. But anyway, I was particularly interested in, of course, some of the stuff you're looking at with respect to the distribution of them socially. And I wondered if you have tried or if you've got any intention to try and split your corpus up into different subcorpora, so that if you look at what your older speakers are doing, or the people with more education versus the people with younger.
I did do that and did some chi-squared tests on that. Because what I wanted to work out was whether that worked well or not, given that I know there are bigger imbalances in the corpus. And what I found was I got significant effects for community that way. But once I looked at this, I didn't. So I thought this was maybe a better way of getting at what was actually happening.
What do you mean by this? When you looked at like this, you didn't get
effects for community? So looking at serial verb constructions, I had near significant effects for community with Melimart. When I did it as just chopping up the corpus and looking just at serial verb constructions by community, which is kind of what I was saying about if you exclude the other things that, the other factors that I know are in balance in each subcorpus, I end up with a significant effect for Mele-Ma'at. That's probably just because there were more educated people in Mele-Ma'at. There was an imbalance between level of education.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we could have a
Yeah,
chat,
I'll-
because there's
I'll
ways
show
we
you
can
my-
deal with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yes, Alex.
Yeah, many thanks, Eleanor, for this detailed and inspiring talk. I'm especially inspired by something you said towards the end, when you said life in city life, or life in villa, I guess, or tends to trigger less serial verbs, and it totally makes sense. I mean, intuitively. One thing I was thinking was, city life involves quite a lot of new actions that you didn't, that's culture, traditional culture didn't used to have, like driving a car, doing the groceries, using a computer or phone, and so on, and people who are exposed to these new actions are also exposed to verbs, to language, like, as you said, language like English or Bislama, which encapsulate these actions using just one verb, rather than, you could, in principle, one could imagine driving a car would be two verbs, right? Take the car and go, or something.
Yeah.
But so this raises the interesting question of productivity of serial patterns. So, and how much lexicalized I think many serial verb patterns that we see are actually lexicalized. People learn a certain action, like traditional actions of cooking, cutting and breaking, and you do this with a leaf, so you make the datangora, roof, and so on. These are lots of actions, sort of traditional actions, that are already lexicalized as a pair of verbs, right? You rip open, or you do things like that.
True.
Whereas exposure to new actions is not coming as a package with a couple of verbs. It comes with one verb. So I don't know if you...
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It would be interesting to see whether, because I think maybe sort of linked to what Anna was saying about describing something completely novel, maybe in those situations you're more likely to use components where you're actually thinking about them as a composable construction, like this and this, and I'm trying to explain it for the first time to somebody who might not know what I'm talking about. One thing that I think might be a factor in why it was lower here to talk about things in town that are novel, but I mean not that novel to most speakers, it's a very mobile community, is that in Vatlongos we find a really high tolerance for using loan verbs from Bislama. And there's a dedicated construction for doing that with copular verbs as well. This is something I'm writing up at the moment. So for comparison with Raga, where you had 1.6%, for Bislama, it's Bislama loan words in the Vatlongos corpus, it's something like 8%. It's really high. So that might be why, rather than trying to explain driving across town as take car, do this, go there, you're more likely to just use Lambe driver me or something.
Right. Yeah.
So you're more likely to switch into Bislama for that. So that might be why another reason that it's kind of higher level things where, as you say, English and Bislama words often package the whole thing as one word. Thank you.